seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop, steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Diggs. Stay in the got loose. Oh my God! 30. No 10. Touchdown! Are you kidding me? Miracle finish! It's a Minneapolis miracle! Oh my God! No way! Ah! What a miracle finish!
And welcome back to the State of Purple podcast. The podcast that we all thought was dead is finally resurrected. KFAN's weekly Minnesota Vikings podcast. I am AJ Mansour, probably a familiar name and a familiar voice to many of you, but this resurrected version, of the State of Purple podcast does have a new face. It will have a new voice for many of you, but if you visit KFAN.com fairly often, you may have seen his name and seen his work. His name is Jack Day. He is one of our KFAN Vikings.com, KFAN.com, we'll go with Vikings reporters. He's helped us out a lot the last year covering the Minnesota Vikings. He has a history of covering the Minnesota Vikings, kind of working for the Minnesota Vikings, but we'll bring him into the fold this year weekly as we go on, and as we have breaking news, we'll pop in. This is a weekly podcast that will also pop in for breaking news as we go. But before we dive into this week's news and kind of kick this thing back off for the first time in about a year and a half or so, I'm going to introduce Jack Day. Jack, welcome to the fold. Obviously, you've been part of the KFAN family for a little while now, but welcome to the State of Purple podcast, my new co-host. We're going to take this thing on into the season, into the off season, and welcome, man. Tell us a little bit about your background. What do you bring to the table? How long you've been covering the Minnesota Vikings?
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on here. I'm looking forward to getting this thing up and running again. So, a little bit of a backstory. I've been covering the Vikings for probably 4, 5, 6 years now. There was a little bit of a gap, like you said, interned for the Vikings, so I wasn't covering them at the time. I was actually working for the team as a PR intern. Wrote about them for a smaller startup blog during my time at college up at UMD in Duluth. That lasted for about a year, and then reached out did some work for Vikings Territory, still do a podcast through them as well. A little bit of writing for Vikings Wire as well. And then I think it was probably about a year and a half or so that I started bothering you with articles for KFAN, just shooting you some stuff. I think it was a lot of pre-draft stuff is when it really took off on KFAN.com, obviously, and haven't stopped since. So I've enjoyed doing the writing side of things, and I'm really looking forward to jumping into this and kind of restarting this podcast back up.
Well, absolutely, man. And we've appreciated having you in the midst of a pandemic and the world shutting down. My focus shifted a lot here at KFAN to a bunch of new things, and you kind of saved my butt. When I didn't have time to write and cover the team, you were always there pumping out content and covering the breaking news as it came in. So I appreciate that personally. I know the people who follow this station and enjoy this station also appreciate it too. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been much coverage. So thanks for doing that. Like I said, this is going to be a weekly podcast. We will record these, I think, every Tuesday, and we'll pump them out shortly thereafter. And we'll duck in for a shorty every once in a while if there is big breaking news that does pop up in between Tuesdays. But it will be regular. We're going to keep this thing going, and this will be the KFAN Weekly Vikings podcast, really the only one that exists right now. So we're going to carry that through the offseason. Mini camp starting up this weekend, into OTAs, into training camp, and then obviously throughout the season as well. So I'm glad that this thing has been resurrected. This was my baby that barely got off the ground, and now we're going to keep it going. So Jack, we are a week or so removed, a week and a half removed from the NFL draft. Minnesota Vikings walk away with 11 new players. We'll kind of go through that list and talk about maybe a couple specific players here or there, but what are your overall feelings coming out of that draft? It was a typical Vikings draft, lots of trading back, lots of accumulating picks, but they only did walk away with 11. What were your thoughts when you were walking away after that draft wrapped up last Saturday?
I think it was fair for everyone to expect a little bit that Rick Spielman was going to go into this draft with the mindset of attempting to move back. Obviously, I think the fan base is a little bit torn between not landing Justin Fields and then moving back and landing Christian Darrisaw there at pick 23. But overall, I think it was a really, really solid draft. I gave it an A- with my draft recap. I think there was a couple selections that felt like reaches at times, but at the end of the day, I'd like to think a lot of these scouts know what they're doing, and they have some favorites, and they had some favorites going in the draft. But like I said, overall, I think with the trade back, you're able to go out and get a guy like Kellen Mond, have someone that the Vikings really haven't had since they went out and got Kirk Cousins. They haven't had that developmental. I mean, they had Nate Stanley and Jake Browning on the practice squad, but they never had. I wrote this in my article that I posted last night too. The Sean Mannion era has come to an end, and it's officially time for Vikings fans to have a little bit of excitement at that backup quarterback position, which, like I said, it feels kind of weird because they grabbed onto the Kyle Slaughter preseason stuff a couple years ago where they're like, hey, this guy's tearing it up in the preseason. Maybe he should be the starter. I don't think that should necessarily be the case with Kellen Mond early. Kirk Cousins is obviously the guy in 2021, but overall, they shored up that offensive line, and they got some new tools on defense for Mike Zimmer as well. So I think they did a pretty solid job. A couple reaches here and there, but overall, I think it was a really solid effort.
Yeah, the one thing that you can walk away knowing is that the Minnesota Vikings, every organization, but we can have confidence that the Minnesota Vikings were prepared for this draft. You can make a plan. You can hope that players fall to you, even with your first pick in the first round. You have that opportunity and that thought of who's going to fall to you, but one different pick, one off the board, off the wall pick from any other team could completely blow that up. So especially as you get into the second and third rounds and lots of moving parts are happening in front of you, the fact that we have confidence in that team, the draft team, the scouting team behind the scenes, Rick Spielman, and the decision making that he's making to more often than not make good decisions. You have that confidence to know that they're going to walk away with the best players that were available to them. It may not be the players that the fans wanted, may not be the players that the Vikings necessarily wanted, but they got the best players available at that position, at that opportunity. Now, let's go through some of these picks. The Vikings end up trading back in the first round with the New York Jets. They end up with an offensive lineman, Christian Darrisaw. Overall thoughts, this is going to be a position that he's going to come in, probably start right away. What are your thoughts on Darrisaw, on the Darrisaw pick, let's say?
I think it was probably the most pressing need that this team had going into the draft with the Riley Reiff departure earlier this offseason, on top of an offensive line unit that has already been fairly atrocious, if you want to use that word, over the last several seasons. So you go out and you get a big-bodied 6'5", 320-pound left tackle. He's a true left tackle as well. He's not going to be moved around. You're not going to draft him and say, hey, here's our right guard or left guard of the future. No, he's a true left tackle. Fits that outside zone scheme that they like to run. He's got the athleticism, and there's multiple scenarios on tape as well of him really just bodying guys and being the bully on film. And I think the Vikings desperately needed that. There was some stuff circulating Twitter yesterday, some of his film where he was doing that to guys. And unfortunately, one of the guys he was doing that to was Chaz Surratt, who the Vikings took later on in this draft. But I'm excited for it. I've said this on my own podcast. I've said this in my writing. It's hard to get excited for offensive linemen, but when a team needs offensive linemen as desperately as they have needed over the last several seasons, we've seen Kirk Cousins struggle with pressure up the middle. We've seen Riley Reiff kind of had some ups and downs in purple as well. So I think it was a no-brainer pick. You go out and you get a top 3 left tackle. After trading back, you get a developmental quarterback, which we'll address in a little bit, I'm assuming, as well. And you have another pick that also shored up the offensive line just from moving from pick 14 back to pick 23.
In fairness to Chaz Surratt, a mammoth of offensive linemen should usually win that battle against a linebacker.
True.
If the quickness can't get out there. But that being said, yeah, Christian Darrisaw, the one thing that everyone says about him is that he's mean. This is an attitude kind of that this Minnesota Vikings team doesn't have a whole lot of. This meanness, this toughness that if someone messes with you, they're going to mess back. They're going to be the one to take that block to the ground, finish a block and finish whatever they're working on. It's good. Can that translate to the NFL? We'll have to wait and see. Obviously, a lot of moving parts on that offensive line with some new faces coming in. But again, we walked away from this draft, from this free agency, with a better offensive line. It's not saying a whole lot, but a better offensive line than they had last year. The second round didn't exist. We all had hoped it would, with multiple third rounds and multiple fourth round picks because of that trade in that first round. But it didn't exist. Now, before we move on from that, Jack, how much do you think the entirety of this draft was dictated by the lack of a second-round pick for this team. That's a big value that they kind of wasted in that Yannick Ngakoue trade. How much of their decision-making do you think was determined because they didn't have a second-round pick?
I think it had a lot to do with that. You go back and you look at over the years, Rick Spielman, some of these guys that they've found in the second round, they're absolute superstars on the Vikings roster right now. A few that come to mind, Eric Kendricks was a second-round pick. Delvin Cook was a second-round pick, and that's arguably the best player on both sides of the ball for the Vikings. So it was kind of frustrating to see them go out, get Yannick Ngakoue, the whole dilemma, and then trade him away again last season. But at the end of the day, they were able to acquire two additional third-round picks in the trade back, which I think they could have slid back into the second round, but Rick Spielman said it in one of his press conferences. I think they felt that the value in this draft, and I kind of had a similar regard to how this draft fell. I think a lot of the value was there from the third and fourth rounds, and I think the Vikings absolutely – it was a little nerve-wracking at times. I'm sure that draft room was a little bit nervous at times because they weren't – I mean, it was out of their hands, essentially, if a player was going to fall to them. And I think a lot of the guys that they wanted ended up falling into their laps.
Yeah, the next pick on the board for the Vikings, number 66 overall in that third round, a quarterback out of Texas A&M, Kellen Mond. The fan base kind of went crazy over this one, as fan bases are wont to do when you have a quarterback who is highly compensated, has good statistics, but doesn't seem to get you over that hump. What the fan base does is they go and they look for a quarterback that is everything that the current quarterback is not. He's mobile. He can do this. He can do that. All the characteristics of a quarterback that Kirk Cousins doesn't have, Kellen Mond brings to the table. Now, he is a third-round pick. He was in the third round for a reason. He is not as accomplished in the NFL, clearly, as Kirk Cousins. He was not as accomplished in college as Kirk Cousins. You have all these things, but you have a developmental quarterback, the highest that they've taken for a little while now, in the third round in Kellen Mond. Do you think that this is their plan for the future, to have Kellen Mond develop into a potential starting quarterback a year or two from now when Kirk Cousins' contract comes off the books?
I do. I think it's either part of a plan that they're going to use and they're going to start gearing up this team for the Kellen Mond era, or it's going to be they have a little bit of leverage now that they didn't have with Sean Mannion. I don't think Kirk Cousins is going into practice every day and going into game days thinking, you know what, Sean Mannion is not, he wasn't going to create any buzz sitting behind Kirk Cousins, because the fan base knew Kirk Cousins is hands down the better quarterback over Sean Mannion. And I think I'm still sitting here, and I think you're still sitting here saying Kirk Cousins, yes, he still is a better prospect. He's a better, more polished quarterback than what Kellen Mond is. But like you said, Kellen Mond is just so different. And this fan base, it craves that different it factor in the quarterback position. The word mobility is a term that gets thrown out regularly by the fan base, and Kellen Mond has that. He runs a lot faster 40-yard dash than Kirk Cousins ran. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I can promise you that all you need to do is turn on the tape and you're going to see Kellen Mond's a little bit quicker. But he's an exciting prospect. He has records at Texas A&M. He threw for over 9,000 yards. That's a record. I think it was 71 total touchdowns through the air that he threw as well. So that was another record, and he's developmental. And like I said earlier, it's a little bit worrisome because I think the fan base is going to take that, and the first bad game that Kirk Cousins has next year, if he comes out and has a game like he did against the Atlanta Falcons last year, there's going to be a lot of people saying, hey, we have this shiny new tool that's been developing under Kirk Cousins. Is he ready to do that? And the third round, he's a third-round quarterback, but Russell Wilson was a third-round quarterback. I believe Dak Prescott was a fourth-round quarterback, and the Vikings starting quarterback, Kirk Cousins, was a fourth-round quarterback as well. So there is a lot of areas that he needs to improve, but you turn on the tape and the upside's there. He makes some beautiful throws. He's got a quick release, and he has the arm strength as well. You top that with some mobility, this fan base is going to be craving that at the first glimpse of Kirk Cousins beginning to struggle in 2021.
Yeah, it is a dangerous pick for the Minnesota Vikings because they will start calling for Kirk's head right away. But again, a different one. And this is hopefully going to light a fire under Kirk's butt. Kirk is going to be the starter this year. There's no question there. Unless an injury pops up, Kirk Cousins is the starting quarterback for this team. But we've heard a ton about his contract, how it has made it difficult here or there for this team to do other things. The teams that do well, we've seen this time and time again. Seattle has done it. San Francisco did it back in the day. Carolina did it back in the day. Many teams do this where they have a young quarterback that's on a rookie contract and they can spend their money elsewhere building a team around them. Is this the idea? I don't know. A third round pick is a third round pick. It could turn into something great, could not. But at the same time, I buy into the mindset of a backup quarterback that is a change of pace from your starting quarterback. Again, if your starting quarterback goes down 9 times out of 10, you're in trouble, and you're not gonna continue a winning season. You have 2 trains of thought though with those backup quarterbacks. Keep a player that is similar in style to your starting quarterback, so your offense doesn't have to change. You don't have to add in bootlegs. You don't have to add in motion. You can still do the same drop pass quarterback, whatever you need to do. That's what we've had for the last couple of years. Now you have this other change of pace where if a team prepares for Kirk Cousins and all of a sudden Kellen Mond comes in either in the middle of a game because of an injury or a late scratch or whatever that is, it's a big adjustment. It's like Joe Webb back in the day. Joe Webb was not a great quarterback in the NFL, but he caused teams problems because they were preparing for Christian Ponder or whoever was in front of him that just was a different quarterback. So I buy into that. I like that idea. Again, it's not a tactic that you develop your team for. They're drafting him hoping he's going to be a starter someday. But I'll take that for the time being as a different change of pace if it does need to come into fruition. Third round, number 78, you mentioned him, Chaz Surratt, linebacker depth. Anything stand out to you about him, or can we move on?
We can. The one thing that's interesting about him is he went to North Carolina to play quarterback, which is odd, obviously, because he played the last 2 seasons, 2019 and 2020, as a linebacker. I think he's a little bit undersized, but he's got what Mike Zimmer loves in his linebackers. He's an athlete first. He's starting to develop better in the pass game as well. I know, like I said, he can get bullied time and again by an offensive lineman, but he's a little bit undersized linebacker. He's not going to come at you like a guy like Anthony Barr. He just doesn't have that size. His first season in 2019, he was a first-team All-ACC runner-up, and then he was the runner-up for ACC Defensive Player of the Year as well. That was his first season on defense, so it shows that he has the upside. He still needs to learn the position a little bit, but he's talented. Anyone that can switch from quarterback to linebacker and be runner-up for an entire Power 5 conference, it says something about his skill set. So clearly the Vikings like something there. I personally thought it was a little bit early for this pick, and a guy like Wyatt Davis was still on the board at the time, so I was a little bit stressed out. That wasn't the direction they were trying to go, but obviously the board fell in their favor, and we're going to get to that pick next.
Yeah, it was 8 picks later. They got Wyatt Davis, a guard out of Ohio State. Now, this was a guy whose name was heavily put into the second round. You even saw some projections where it was the late first round kind of a pick. I know the Vikings were thrilled that he was still on the board there after they moved around a little bit. But this was a position and a player that I think a lot of people were excited was still there. Position of need that they could fill both that guard spot and that left tackle spot, so you don't have to worry about the questions of who you're going to move, if you're going to go O'Neal right to left or if you're going to put Darisaw inside, whatever that might be. All those possibilities, they're gone now because Wyatt Davis was still on the board. Were you as excited as everyone else seemed to be when Wyatt Davis was available for them at pick number 86 and they did go up and get him?
Yeah, as excited as someone like myself can be over an interior offensive lineman
Right.
getting drafted, yes. I think there were even, before the injury happened, there were several mocks circulating Twitter that had Wyatt Davis going in the first round to the Vikings, whether that was before the season was officially over, I think. So it was somewhere in that 13 it was 10 to 16, 17 range. It was at that point where they knew where they were going to be picking, and Wyatt Davis was a name that was circulating around this team. But he also plays with a nastiness to his game. He's not the most athletic, so he's not like a 100% fit as much as what Christian Darisaw is going to bring to this team. He's not as athletic in the run game as that, but when he's inside and you turn on the film, he plays with a nastiness to his game, which I think, like you said earlier, this team has been lacking on the offensive line for many years.
Yeah, I'm going to breeze through the rest of these picks, and then we'll go back. And if any of them stand out to you, you want to say anything about them specifically, feel free to go back. Third round, they got Patrick Jones, the second, a defensive end out of Pittsburgh. Fourth round, their first pick was Kene Nwangwu, a running back, a returner out of Iowa State. Fourth round continues with Cameron Bynum, their first cornerback, which that's a position of need with this whole Gladney situation still up in the air. But they don't get a cornerback until the fourth round. Continues fourth round, Janarius Robinson, a defensive end out of Florida State, Amir Smith-Marset, a wide receiver out of Iowa, Zach Davidson, the tight end out of Central Missouri in the fifth round, and then Jalen Twyman, the defensive tackle out of Pittsburgh. Out of that last three rounds right there, anybody stand out to you as somebody of note that might have an opportunity to do something this year for the Minnesota Vikings?
Yeah, one of the first articles that I wrote, I think it was after the second day of the draft, so it was the Friday night or the Saturday morning before the draft started. I just said, I highlighted how good the Vikings did at finding, not only did they find value, but they found value at positions of need, and they continued to do that on day 3 of the draft. Patrick Jones is a guy that I think you're going to see in that defensive end rotation early and often, but I think Janarius Robinson, the Florida State pass rusher, he brings a different set of skills than what Patrick Jones II is going to bring. He's more of the quote-unquote Andre Patterson project type. He's got the freakishly long arms. I think his wingspan ranks in like the 96th percentile or something. So he's one of those players that you hear he was a little bit underproductive at Florida State, but he has the tool sets that I think a guy like Andre Patterson craves. And then just going into the fifth round as well, Amir Smith-Marset, a wide receiver. This team still needs a wide receiver 3 unless they feel comfortable going out and having Chad Beebe or BC Johnson at wide receiver 3. I think there's a legitimate chance that Amir Smith-Marset creates some buzz throughout training camp. And we know that the Vikings, Mike Zimmer doesn't necessarily like to throw wide receivers out early, especially rookie wide receivers. It took Justin Jefferson 3 games before they finally gave him the entire playbook. Stephon Diggs is another one that comes to mind. He was a 5th round pick as well. Amir Smith-Marset, also a 5th round pick. But if you go back to Diggs' rookie year, there was some buzz around him in training camp and rookie mini camps, but they kind of eased him into the offense as well. So I don't fully expect him to come out and be wide receiver 3 in game 1, but I definitely think there's going to be some buzz circulating around him. Him and Nwangu are both going to be in competition for the returning battle as well, a position this team desperately needed help at from a year ago as well.
Right, absolutely. You know, that's where these picks later in the draft are going to find their headway, is on special teams, whether it's be a coverage unit or a return unit. This team was basically last in every category when it comes to special teams: field goals, punts, coverage, starting field position, returns. I mean, all that across the board was pretty darn bad. Marwan Malouf was not renewed for his contract this year, so they're changing almost everything up with new people bringing into that mold. You mentioned Nwangu and Smith-Marset having that opportunity to battle for the return and punt return positions. All these guys are going to be involved on coverage units. You have a punter that they brought in as an undrafted. You have Shane Zylstra, yeah. That they brought in as a tight end position, another open spot with some voids as far as the depth for tight ends on this team. That's what you're looking at with this back end of the draft, is special teams and depth players. Can they fill in with some depth? Can they provide something on special teams? And this team needs to take a giant step forward. I mean, that just when you look at starting field position alone, that allows a team like this that has a pretty dynamic offense. They can put points on the board. Kirk has proven that he can do things. Dalvin, Justin Jefferson, we know, Irv Smith Jr., all these things across the board, the way that they can move the football. If you give them an 8-yard head start above what they had last year, that's a big difference. That at the very least flips field position more often than not, but it also allows you to score more points. So a big focus. Ryan Ficken is the new elevated up to the new special teams coordinator. You have an opportunity there to make a big improvement there, and that's where some of these guys are going to do that. Now, Jack, this is what's happening on this side of the border. Now, let's take a quick hop over the St. Croix, over to the other side of the border where our pets' heads are falling off at Lambeau Field. It's old news now, but Aaron Rodgers is very unhappy. The thing that isn't old news is that this isn't going away. You know, this popped up on draft day. It was a PA who I think was the first one to mention that there were reports that the San Francisco 49ers were inquiring about a trade to get Aaron Rodgers. Later in the day, you have Schefter dropping a bomb about how Aaron Rodgers doesn't want to be in Green Bay. You have Schlereth reporting that the Denver Broncos have finalized a trade for Aaron Rodgers. All these things popped up on draft day. We are, 12 days removed from draft day at this point now on Tuesday, May 11th, and you have this situation has not gotten any better. You continue to have Rodgers throwing the owner, the general manager under the bus. You have other players that are stepping in and talking about how they're going to have to reconsider. Davante Adams is going to have to reconsider his time in Green Bay if Aaron Rodgers isn't there. This is almost 2 weeks into this situation, Jack, and it has not gotten any better. They have not put out this fire. This could change the landscape of the division. It could change the landscape of the league. But what are your initial thoughts on this Aaron Rodgers situation? Do you think that there is fire where there seems to be a lot of smoke?
I think so. I mean, everything on Twitter, the Schefter reports as well, the Davante Adams news should be also terrifying for Packers fans because personally speaking, if they get to a point where Aaron Rodgers is out and Davante Adams is out, I think you're losing not only a top 3 quarterback in the NFL, right, but you're also losing a top 3 wide receiver going out the door with him. Obviously, that wasn't confirmed, but it sure made grading the draft for every other NFC North team a lot easier because if Aaron Rodgers is out of the NFC North, I think this is going to – you can almost say that every single team in the NFL, you don't even have to look at the picks. It was an A-plus draft because now you have a division that – the Vikings have battled, the Bears have battled at times. Detroit really hasn't been. They've been kind of an afterthought in the division. But Aaron Rodgers has ruled this division because he is what this every other team in this division has been hungry for. They're hungry for that true franchise quarterback that can absolutely elevate a team around him. And he's playing, or he's not playing. He's angry because they're not giving him what other teams, like the Vikings are giving Kirk Cousins a much better team. When Kirk Cousins came here in 2018, he was getting the keys handed to him for a much better offense and defense, in my opinion. And Aaron Rodgers was ticked off after that Jordan Love pick last year. And I think that's rightfully so, because it sounds like from the reports that I've seen, Aaron Rodgers was never made aware of that pick. And it sounds like when the Vikings were talking about Justin Fields and then they selected Kellen Mond, that was at least put on the radar of Kirk Cousins. Like he was in the loop of everything. He knew what was going on. And it sounds like Aaron Rodgers was absolutely blindsided by that. And I think he has a little bit of a right to be pissed off about it.
Yeah, there is the two sides of every story, and some people are siding with the franchise, some people are siding with the quarterback. We're going to side with the quarterback and get him on out of here and take what we can from that. Now, another weird one popped up. I wrote a goofy article about it. Zero substantiability to this claim, but there was a weird report that popped up on social media, kind of took fire within Vikings Twitter world, of the possibility of the Vikings trading for Julio Jones. Now, as far as I can tell, this is a non-substantiated report from a Vikings fan who put this out there, but it did catch a little steam. And I think it's just somebody putting two and two together. You know, Julio Jones probably not going to be with the Falcons. They're looking to move on. They're looking to shed cap. The Vikings need a wide receiver. Boom. The Vikings are trading for Julio Jones. That's as far as I can see where this really came from. It doesn't seem to fit with the salary cap. It doesn't seem to fit with the fit with the team. Bringing in a veteran, old 32-year-old wide receiver. He's good. Don't get me wrong. He's really good. But do you have any thoughts on that? I don't even want to call it a report. That rumor that popped up yesterday about Julio Jones to the Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah, I don't think there's any truth to it. I haven't heard anything either. I think it's a lot more realistic, like a guy like D.D. Westbrook, who there also has been rumors circulating that there's at least some preliminary interest in D.D. Westbrook. That's a lot more realistic for a team that is still trying to battle its way out of salary cap issues. I don't think bringing a wide receiver to Minnesota, one, it could end up costing a little bit too much money. The Vikings got Stephon Diggs is a much younger wide receiver, but they got a first-round pick out of Stephon Diggs. And if we're even talking first, second-round picks, I want the Vikings to be able to go into the 2022 draft cycle and have all of those picks, because we've seen how important it is for Rick Spielman and company to have that second-round pick. I don't like the idea of it. Not trying to take anything away from the game that Julio Jones would bring to Minnesota, because I think he'd be special in this offense. Justin Jefferson, Julio Jones, and Adam Thielen, that would be a three-headed monster of wide receivers, and you still have one of the best running games in the NFL as well right behind it. But I don't think it's realistic. I haven't heard any truth to that from anyone that I've talked to, so I'm not going to get my hopes up and anticipate 32-year-old Julio Jones is coming to Minnesota.
No, but it is the kind of fun stuff that does pop up this time of year and give us something to talk about. Another name, you mentioned Dede Westbrook, has been tied to the Minnesota Vikings, maybe as that opportunity for a wide receiver. Another name that has popped up, Ryan Kerrigan, this edge rusher, linebacker, defensive end, depending on what defense. He'd be a defensive end here in Minnesota. What are your thoughts on the potential of him joining this team?
I would like that. I don't necessarily want to go out, like I just said, the salary cap is starting to become a question. And going back to the Cameron Bynum pick as well, that cornerback that they took out of Cal, it was actually announced when they made that selection that he's going to make the transition to the safety position. So that cornerback position is also a position that I could see looking in free agency. I don't think there's a lot out there right now, which is kind of worrisome. And I haven't heard much on the Jeff Gladney situation either, but I would like getting Kerrigan in here. I don't know if he's necessarily going to be a 3-down starter. I don't know if anyone's going to be a 3-down starter at that edge position opposite of Danielle Hunter, just because they went out and they drafted a few guys. They have DJ Wanham. They brought Stephon Weatherly back. I think there's going to be some sort of pass rushing rotation. That was hard to say. And we've seen that with Andre Patterson and Mike Zimmer over the years. We really saw it a couple years ago when they went into New Orleans and they had Everson Griffin and Danielle Hunter rushing from the inside, and they put two of the rotational ends on the outside, and just they were able to generate some steam from that interior of the defensive line as well. So I think getting a veteran presence here would also help, just because you have Danielle already on the other side. You have all of these young and unproven players on the other side. So bringing in a veteran who might not necessarily be the 3-down starter, but just getting him in. I think he had 5.5 sacks, and he wasn't even the starter for Washington last year. So getting a veteran voice into that locker room and that positional group would be beneficial for the Vikings.
Yeah, definitely. Right now, I think the Vikings have about $7 million in cap space. Almost all of that is going to go to the rookies. They do get a little cap relief June 1st for the Kyle Rudolph situation, but right now they have approximately $0. So they got to get creative and do some stuff. But there's still some time to do that. So those prices will go down. The players will find their options start to dwindling, and they'll have to make a decision if they want to keep playing. That's how it works every single season. All right, Jack, let's tie a knot on this. What do you have up at kfan.com that our listeners can go and check out right now?
So right now, I posted this last night, actually. I wrote an article titled Young and Intriguing Vikings Players to Keep an Eye on Ahead of Minicamp. Kind of touches on some of the guys that we talked about today, also touches on an undrafted free agent from the draft cycle of last year that I have a little bit higher hopes for than I think some of the Vikings fan base. Then I can at least mention the name. Miles Dorn was an undrafted safety out of North Carolina last year, got stuck on the IR earlier in the season last year, so Vikings fans didn't get to see him on special teams. But the Vikings over the years have really found that undrafted or late round safety presence to go well next to Harrison Smith. I'm not quite sure how many years Harrison Smith has left playing at an elite level, but getting him in, having a full offseason, having a preseason, I think it's going to be beneficial. And it's an extremely, extremely thin position at safety for the Vikings as well. So I think he has a chance at cracking that 53-man roster. But there's 4 other names on that list as well that we talked about a little bit this afternoon, but make sure to go check that out if you get a chance.
Absolutely. That's the Vikings blog at kfan.com. You can get Jack's stuff there multiple times throughout the week as he continues to cover this team as the day-to-day changes. But we will be back for another episode of the State of Purple podcast next Tuesday. You can find the State of Purple podcast, old episodes that are way outdated, but you can subscribe to the State of Purple podcast on iHeartRadio, iTunes, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts as we continue this weekly podcast for Minnesota Vikings football coverage, and then we'll jump in whenever there's breaking news. So we are officially back. Jack Day, AJ Mansour, the State of Purple podcast has returned. We'll see you next week for another episode.
10 seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. On by Diggs. Stay up.